Okay, we're now going live on Facebook and YouTube. That's what I get for running a few minutes late. We end up missing things that need to happen. Okay, we're now live on Facebook and YouTube. So as we were saying that even within the dynastical, the more aristocratic institutions of Judaism, like the priesthood, like the king, where the king has to be a descendant of David for the most part. We'll see there are many exceptions throughout history, and the priest has to be a descendant of Aaron. Still, the leader is always going to be the person who's most worthy, and that's why the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, in theory, should always go to the most worthy person. And even though the king has to be a descendant of David, it has to be the most worthy descendant of David. And when there's no dynastical requirement, then for sure it goes to the most worthy person. And that was the situation when Moshe Rabbeinu, when Moses passes away, that the most worthy person to take on the mantle of leadership was none other than Yehoshua, was Joshua, his main student. Now, our sages say that Moshe pnei Chama v'Yoshua pnei Levana, that Moses was like the sun and Joshua was like the moon. In other words, in many ways, Joshua's greatness was that he was such a reflection of Moshe, such a almost like a carbon copy in many ways of Moshe Rabbeinu, that if Moses was the greatest leader as the sun, then Joshua was right behind him as the moon. And when Joshua takes over the mantle of leadership, so ends the Torah, and so begins the books of prophets. Now, at this point, for the most part, the only recordings of Jewish history we have are still just the Tanakh. Again, Josephus does write these events, but he's really just, for the most part, copying them either from Tanakh or from the Septuagint. And but we're now transitioning from the 5 books of Moses into the 6th book of the Bible, the first book of the prophets, the book of Joshua. Now, just a quick word about the structure of the Jewish Bible, and we're going to talk more about it a little bit later when it was actually canonized, which is during the time of the Second Temple. But just so we understand the structure as we're pulling from the history that is spoken about in these books. So the 5 books of Moses were divinely taught to, or divinely put into the mind and the hands of Moshe, and were exclusively written down by Moshe. The first 4 books are just Moshe transmitting what the Almighty tells him to write down. And the book of Deuteronomy is an exception to that slightly, that while it's still divinely, divine input, we would say, it's Moshe in his own words. Now, the question comes up as to who wrote the last few verses of the Torah, because the last few verses describe the death of Moshe. And it's kind of hard to write after you die. I mean, they do say that we all know what Beethoven was doing after he passed away. He was in his study erasing his great works. In other words, he was decomposing. But anyway, but when the question that the Talmud discusses, who wrote the last few verses of the Torah? And there's several different opinions. One opinion is that Joshua wrote the last few verses of the Torah. One opinion is that Moshe wrote it as a prelude to what was about to happen with tears in his eyes. Another opinion is that Moshe wrote it, but in a way that had no spaces, so it's not comprehensible, and Joshua later put the spaces in. Be it as it may, that's the discussion. And we'll find a similar discussion with many of the books of the prophets. While for the most part, the books of the prophets are written by the namesake. In other words, the book of Joshua is written by Joshua, the book of Samuel is written by Samuel, etc. And all of those books, the star, so to speak, the leading character, passes away. So in those cases, our sages usually come to fill in who finished the book. So Joshua is the author of the book of Joshua. When he dies, it's finished off by Pinchas, who was the high priest at that time. Now, just one more word on the structure. We're entering now what we refer to as the books of the prophets. So when we look at the Jewish Bible, we have the 24 books of the Bible that's made up of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then the 19 books of the prophets and the writings. So the prophets are also subdivided into 2 categories. referred to as the Nevi'im HaRishonim, the early prophets, and the Nevi'im HaAchronim, the later prophets. Now, that has nothing to do with the chronology of their prophecy. In other words, the Nevi'im Rishonim actually span the whole First Temple time period. I'm sorry, from Joshua through the whole First Temple time period. And the Nevi'im Achronim span from about halfway through the First Temple till the beginning of the Second Temple. So it's not a chronological division. What it actually is a division of really style. That the Nevi'im Rishonim, the early prophets, are really quite historical in their writing. The early prophets are the books of Joshua, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now, you notice I don't say Samuel 1 and Samuel 2 or Kings 1 and Kings 2, because from a Jewish perspective, there's only one book of Samuel and one book of Kings. It was later either the Septuagint or the Christians after that subdivided the book into two books, but there's really only one book of Samuel and one book of Kings. But be it as it may, their division of the books, and more specifically the division of chapters that they gave us, which was not originally there, is very useful and handy. So we stick with it and we use it. But those books, again, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, those four books are the books of the early prophets, meaning that they're telling the story. That's the historical outline. Now, after that, we go to the latter prophets, which, as they're organized in our Bible, go like this. They go Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets, right? I don't think I'm leaving anyone out there. Now, again, the 12 minor prophets are not minor. There's nothing minor about them. The only reason they're referred to as minor prophets is because they're short. And because they were short, less than 10 chapters for the most part, sometimes only one chapter, they were sort of gathered together into one book that we call the 12, the Treyasa, the 12 prophets, 12 minor prophets. But they really span, starting with the time period of Elijah the prophet is probably the earliest one, Avadia, going up until the after the destruction of the First Temple. And so the later prophets are stylistically different than the earlier prophets. They're really just prophecy. They're admonishing the Jewish people for what is going on at whatever point they were prophesying in. So that's the books of the prophets. Again, a subdivision there. The early, more historical. The later, more prophetical. That's the prophets. And then we have the books of the writings, what we call ksuvim. Now, the books of the writings are made up of Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Divrei Hayamim, and the five Megillas. I'm sorry, forgot those, the five Megillas. So again, Ezra, Nehemiah, the five Megillas, which are the book of Ruth, the book of Lamentations, the book of Song of Songs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the book of Ruth. Those are the five Megillas. And Proverbs, Psalms, and Divrei Hayamim, which is Chronicles. Now, those are not books of prophecy. They are subdivided into what we call the writings because they are other writings that were canonized in our Bible that were written by prophets. Okay, so while they're not prophecies per se, they are prophetic writings of the prophets. Now, what's the difference? The difference is when we're talking about the five books of Moses and the books of the prophets, we're talking about things that were said specifically from the Almighty through the prophet. When we talk about the writings, we're talking about the prophets using their own divine inspiration to write down whatever it was that they were writing down. Now, as we'll see, we'll be drawing from a lot of those writings throughout this time period as well, because they're, again, not in any way chronological. In fact, we're going to get to the story of Ruth next week, because chronologically, the story of Ruth happens during the time of Judges, as it says in the introduction, and that we're going to really cover next week. The Megillah, the book of Esther, we'll cover after the destruction of the First Temple, when it happened, and et cetera, et cetera. We'll pick things up where they were chronologically. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. That is, but that's a quick summary of the books of the Bible, and we're going to be drawing the history that comes out of those books as we have them. Okay. So if I lost you with that, tune back in. We're now back to the story. Yeah. So Joshua takes over. Now, Moses died on the 7th day of Adar, and we're told that the first thing that happened, obviously, was the mourning for Moshe, what we call the Shloshim, the 30 days of mourning. The whole nation mourns, stays put in the plains of Moab, and essentially mourns Moshe for 30 days. And after that point, on the 7th day of the month of Nisan, it's finally time for Joshua to assume his leadership. And he stands up and says, okay, the time period of mourning for Moshe has ended. It is now time to enter the land of Israel after a 40-year stint in the desert, which, as we mentioned last week and I believe the week before, should have only taken a few months. A few months became 40 years. And now after that 40 years, almost exactly 40 years to the day of the Exodus, because the Exodus was on the 15th of the month of Nisan, and the preparation to enter the land begins on the 7th day of Nisan. And we're going to see they actually enter the land on the 10th of Nisan. But before they enter the land, they send spies. Now, you might think by this point, after last week's discussion, spies are a pretty bad idea. But Joshua learned from the lessons of being one of the previous quote unquote good spies. And he sends very specific people to do the spying. He sends Pinchas and Kalev. Pinchas was the son of the high priest. Kalev was Joshua's compatriot as a good spy the first time around. And of course, they stick to the mission. They go in, they cross the sea ahead of the Jewish people. By the way, the Jewish people at this point, if you're geographically paying attention, are on the east bank of the Jordan River. They're in modern day Jordan, and basically parallel to where Jericho is, which will be the first city that they will conquer. So Kalev and Pinchas go in to check out the town of the city, the kingdom, whatever it was, of Jericho. And while they are surveying the land, spying the land, they're discovered by a lady by the name of Rachav. Now, we're told that Rachav was a lady of ill repute, but be it as it may, she heeded the warning of Kalev and Pinchas that they were part of this great Jewish nation that they had heard so much about, the great Jewish nation that was originally indigenous to this land that they were on, the great Jewish nation that was going to soon be coming back to reclaim the land that they had to leave 2 centuries before. And she believes it. She wants to help them out. And so she hides out the spies. The king of Jericho sends for her and says, where are those 2 men that came in at night? And she said, oh, I think they left before the city gates were closed. And that's and she hides the men out. And Rachav, before the spies leave the house of Rachav, before Kalev and Pinchas leave the house of Rachav, they say, please, whatever you do, don't rat us out. And she says, I'm sorry, told the story a little wrong. Before they leave, Rachav says to Pinchas and Kalev, please repay my kindness to you by when you conquer the town, spare me and my family. And sure enough, when they come, they end up sparing her, but they also make a deal. They say, that's fine. We'll definitely spare you and your family as long as you don't rat us out. Right? If you rat us out to the king, we ain't going to spare you. And don't worry, we're going to win one way or the other. But as long as you don't rat us out, we will be more than happy to save you and your family. And that's what indeed ends up happening. And that's what, and we're going to see that Rachav actually becomes part of the Jewish people. She converts to Judaism and actually ends up marrying none other than Yehoshua ben Nun, the Joshua. Again, amplifying that idea we said before, that Judaism is a meritocracy. It doesn't matter what you did before. It doesn't matter what your past was. It doesn't matter what your antecedents was. As long as you show a sincere devotion and connection and growth and you work on yourself, you can go to the highest of heights. That is possible for everyone. Now, that's one thing that happens during these 3 days of preparation to enter the land of Israel. But there's another thing that happens. And the other thing that happens is that Joshua sends messages to all of the inhabitants, or all of the kingdoms, the kings, if you will, of the Canaanite nations that have been inhabiting the land of Israel for the past 200 years, 210 years. And he gives them all a choice. Right? They have 3 choices. Choice number 1 is they can stay. Right? Joshua didn't necessarily want to wipe everyone out, didn't want to go to war if it was necessary. He said, you can stay. But if you're going to stay, you have to be our ally, right? You have to be at peace with us, and you have to be what we call a ger toshav. Now, a ger toshav is a title for a non-Jew who accepts upon themselves the 7 Noahide laws, the Noahide code, and basically that was the requirement. Joshua says, "You want to stay," or at least the ambassadors of Joshua say, "You want to stay? That's fine. Just sign a peace treaty with us, become our ally, and follow the Noahide code." That's choice number one. Choice number two is you don't want to do that, right? You don't like the Noahide code. You want to eat the limb of live animals. You like worshiping your idols. That's fine. You can leave, right? That was choice number two. Choice number three was if you stay, then we're gonna have to take matters into our own hands. So lest you think that Joshua just, came in, wiped everyone out, and we were just a warring people, again, as we always say, the story on the surface of our Tanakh often leaves, it's like an iceberg. Like the term, the tip of an iceberg. Why do we talk about it's only the tip of the iceberg? That's because if you see an iceberg, whatever you see above water is maybe 10% of the whole entire iceberg, with 90% underwater. And that's how our Torah works. What we see in the Tanakh, what we see in the Jewish Bible is maybe 10% of the whole story. And this is a case in point, and we'll see examples of it as we go on in the story. But that yes, I'll tell you a funny story. I have a step uncle, I guess is how he's related to me. A little bit of an interesting guy, and let's just say he's basically thrown off his connection to the Jewish people in many ways. And I once ended up in an airport with him. We both had a layover, and he says to me, I decided that one day I was going to sit down and give Judaism one last chance. And I went to this website, 613.com or something like that, to look at what the 613 commandments are. And I saw that one of the commandments was to wipe out the Canaanite nations. And I said, I want no part of a religion that has a commandment to wipe out a nation. Again, that's not even 10% of the story. The whole story, again, is this is our homeland, right? We were there 200 years ago. We never said we were leaving it, in total. Number two, we gave everyone the opportunity to stay, right? On our terms, yes, but to stay. Number three, we gave everyone the opportunity to leave. So these 31 battles that are going to persist from this point forward are the 31 nations that didn't stay. I'm sorry, that didn't listen, so to speak. We're going to see that there's at least one nation that does become a ger toshav, that becomes an ally, and according to our sages, there were a number that did leave, and they later established diplomatic relationships with Joshua. The book of Joshua tells us that none accepted the treaty, but that means that how our sages understand that is that the opportunity to sign the treaty, so to speak, was sent during this time, and then again before each war. Before each war, every nation again has the opportunity to take one of the peaceful outcomes, and none of them do. So that's what happens in the 3 days between the conclusion of the mourning for Moshe and the Jews entering the land of Israel. Joshua sends the spies, he sends the emissaries to try and make peace treaties, and most of the nations do not accept the treaty. So what happens next? On the 10th day of the month of Nisan, with the Aron HaKodesh, the Holy Ark leading the way, the Jews cross the Jordan River, and another miraculous scene similar to that of the splitting of the Red Sea, the splitting of the Yam Suf. The sea splits, the Jews walk through. By the way, it's actually described that it was different than the Yam Suf, that the Yam Suf split, so to speak, down the middle. In other words, two different directions, whereas the sea, the Jordan River split in one way. There's one wall as opposed to two walls. That's what is described to us. But the Jews walk through it, another miracle, and Joshua is elated. He makes a monument on the other side of the Jordan River, and the Jews prepare to celebrate Pesach, their first Pesach in the land of Israel. Now, I just want to point out an interesting fact over here. So we said that this date, we know it from the book of Joshua, was the 10th day of the month of Nisan. How many people observe the holiday of the 10th day of the month of Nisan? No one? I mean, what do you mean? That's when the Jews entered the Israel, the time of the first Commonwealth. And if there's ever been a sojourn of the Jewish people, right? We have three options we're going to discuss: the first Commonwealth, the second Commonwealth, and whatever's going on right now, whatever we would call that. But this one was the longest. It's going to last 400 years. It was the closest to the ideal, even though we're going to see it had many shortcomings. Why don't we as Jews celebrate the entering of the land of Israel and the splitting of the Jordan River at the time of Joshua as a holiday? Right? Excellent question. So in truth, we do give a hat tip to this, or a yarmulke tip to this. How so? At the end of your Passover Seder, when you're pouring the fourth cup of wine, if you make it that far, you likely pour a fifth cup of wine, right? And that fifth cup of wine has a specific name. It's referred to as the Kos Shel Eliyahu, the cup of Elijah, Elijah's cup. So the question is, why are we pouring a fifth cup of wine? And we're only drinking 4 cups, right? We only drink 4, but we're pouring this fifth cup. And no, it's not for the reason that your Sunday school teacher or your parents told you that Elijah is going to come, he's going to drink the wine, and they're going to shake the table a little bit to make some wine fall out so it looks like he drank some. That's not the reason. The reason is this. The 4 cups are symbolic of the 4 languages of redemption that the Jewish people were redeemed with from Egypt. In other words, the Torah tells us that the Jews were, that the Almighty used 4 verbs: lakachti, nisati, hotzesi, and hitzalti. That I'm going to take you out, I'm going to save you, I'm going to bring you out, and I'm going to one second. Hotzesi, I'm going to bring you out. Lakachti, I'm going to take you as a nation. Hitzalti, I'm going to save you. And I think I forgot it because I don't have it in my notes. Anyways, we have the 4 languages of redemption. I'm sure my wife will put it in the chat box for all of us. We have the 4 languages of redemption, and that's why we're drinking the 4 cups of wine. We're drinking the 4 cups of wine to be symbolic, to be a commemoration of the fact that the Almighty took us out of Egypt with 4 languages, 4 different languages. But if we look over there in the book of Exodus, there's a 5th verb, a 5th language over there, and that is the word v'havesi, that Moshe says in the name of the Almighty, v'havesi, that I'm going to bring you to the land of Israel, to the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So why don't we drink that 5th cup? I mean, we just said that Joshua brought the Jewish people into the land of Israel. The answer is that, as I slightly alluded to before, that even though, yes, Joshua brought us into the land of Israel and we were there for 800 years, doesn't make it, right? Temple's destroyed, the nation is thrown into exile, and the first sojourn, the first Commonwealth, comes to a very, very enigmatic ending. So we have a second temple, a second Commonwealth. 420 years we're in the land of Israel. Again, comes to a very enigmatic ending, both of which we are actually mourning right now on the Jewish calendar because we're in the 3 weeks where we mourn both of these destructions. Now we're back in the land of Israel, right? The majority of the world Jewish population lives in the land of Israel, but let's face it, it's a far cry from what was there during either the first temple or the second temple. While we do have the population there, we don't have the temple, we don't have the Sanhedrin, we don't have the Kohanim, we're lacking a lot. So the question becomes, have we ever really entered the land of Israel? We've tried. We've had so far 2.5 experiments, neither of which has ended in success. So therefore, what do? We're not sure if that word ever happened, if we were ever really brought into the land of Israel, as was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So come at the Pesach Seder, the Passover Seder, we pour that 5th cup, but we don't drink it. When will we drink it? When Elijah the prophet comes to herald in the Messianic era, to announce the coming of the Messianic era and the true return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Then we will finally know that we're supposed to drink the 5th cup, because we will have finally entered the land of Israel in the way that we are, so to speak, supposed to, and the way that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Thank you, Nomi. It's the 4 words that I was slipping on before are lakachti, Hashem says, I'll take you as a nation. Hitzalti, I'll save you. Ga'alti, I'll redeem you. And hotzesi, I will physically take you out. Okay, those are the first 4 languages that I was tripping up on before. Okay, so that's the 10th of Nisan. That's why we don't celebrate it as a holiday. And that's why we don't drink the fifth cup at the Seder, and we just pour it and refer to it as Elijah's cup, because when Elijah comes and tells us the redemption has finally happened, that's when we'll drink that cup. Okay, so finally, so the Jews go in, they observe the first Passover in the land of Israel. Everyone who did not get circumcised in the desert gets circumcised, because that was a prerequisite for the Passover offering, and the Passover offering is brought. After that, it is finally time to go on the first conquest to the city of Jericho. Now, as we mentioned before, that the conquest was when the Jews chose in the desert to send spies, they were basically choosing the natural over the supernatural. They were saying, we don't want a completely supernatural existence in the land of Israel. We want it natural. And but even with that, as we're going to see in the story of Joshua, the story of Jericho, that it was still pretty supernatural. So what happens in the city of Jericho? Joshua tells the people, see the mighty city with the mighty walls? Here's the battle plan. We're going to walk around that city over the course of 7 days. 6 days, we're going to make one circuit. We're going to have 2.5 tribes in the front. Then we're going to have a total of 7 Kohanim, of 7 priests, each with their own shofar. And then the ark, and then the remaining 9.5 tribes will be behind the ark. We're going to make one circuit a day. While we are making that circuit, the 7 priests will blow their shofars. And then we're going to go back to our camp in Gilgal, right? Gilgal was the town down the street from Jericho where they were camping out, right? So that's what the Jews do, 6 days. That's the battle plan, right? Day 1, make a circuit, go home. Day 2, make a circuit, go home. Day 3, make a circuit, go home. 6 days they do this. Comes the 7th day, Joshua says, we're 7ing down, all right, I don't know what the word would be, quadruple, but 7 times, right? We're 7ing our, Julie, I'm sure can give me the right word, right? We're 7ing our efforts this time. We're going to do our efforts 7 times, 7-fold what we did on the previous 6 days. We're going to walk around the city 7 times, blowing the shofar 7 times. And on the 7th time, we will yell out our battle cries, and the walls are going to come tumbling down directly into the ground. All the people will flee. If they don't, we're going to kill them. We can't take any booty. Anything that can be used in the treasury of the Mishkan, the gold, silver, copper, should go into the treasury of the Mishkan. Everything else should be burnt. And this is exactly how the book of Joshua tells us it plays out. And as a matter of fact, Joshua wrote, according to many commentaries, Joshua wrote a prayer to commemorate this day. And that prayer was none other than the Aleinu prayer. The Aleinu prayer was written to commemorate this time. So that's how Jericho is conquered. Now, you might say, okay, Rabbi, you're telling some great fairy tales, some great folklore, some great Jewish stories in the Bible. But what's very interesting to point out, and this is a question that Jewish wannabe academics like myself always are curious about and always looking into, and that is what corroborative evidence is there for the Torah? What is the historicity of the Torah? As you know, for if you've been attending the previous 11 sessions, we treat the Torah as our history. So, but besides the Torah, what else do we have? So with the book of Joshua, we have our first archaeological proofs, so to speak, to what we're reading in the book of Joshua to tell us that it is a historical fact. Now, what are the 3 historical proofs? And there's been a number of digs at Jericho. One of the most famous was by none other than Kathleen Kenyon, who was no Philo-Semite herself. In fact, she would only dig in the land of Israel in areas that were controlled by Jordan between the 48 and the 67 war. That's when she would dig in Jerusalem and Jericho. But be it as it may, she was the first archaeologist to dig in Jericho. The famous Yigal Yadin, who I think we talked about before, he also dug in Jericho, and many others have been there. It's a very famous archaeological site in the land of Israel. Now, as we've addressed, we can't say it often enough, archaeology, while it's fascinating and I personally love it and would love to be more involved with it at one point in my later days, in my future days, it is, like many studies of antiquity, a very inexact science, right? It's like archaeology is all based on, you find a piece of pottery and you say, oh, this looks just like the pottery found over here. So when we draw all kinds of conclusions based on the fact that it's similar pottery. Okay, I'm over exaggerating and I really do find it fascinating, but we have to remember it is a very inexact science. So when we're talking about archaeology, either yay or nay to prove the historicity of the Torah, just know that, take it with a grain of sand, so to speak. So, we talked about this. We're talking about the Exodus and certain circumstantial evidence we have to the Exodus. But with the digs at Jericho, there have been at least what I find 3 very significant findings. Number one is they have found, the different parts of the walls of Jericho they have excavated, make it look as if the walls indeed sunk into the ground. They'll say it's because of an earthquake, they'll say because of whatever, but they don't have the appearance of their, number one, being a siege, and at some point the walls being breached. They have not found a breach in the walls, but they have found evidence of what it makes it look like the walls have collapsed. Now, what is that evidence? That evidence is they found stones stacked on top of each other with the red mortar or clay or whatever was used to attach those stones out on the sides of those stones. And that's what has been found at several sites of the walls of Jericho. So that would be, we'd say, okay, a proof that the walls fell in as described in the book of Joshua. Number 2, that Rachav, who we mentioned before, we know from the book that she lived in her apartment or her house, whatever it was in the wall of the city. Meaning that it was similar to how you see in the old city today, that you have many buildings that go right up to the wall. Well, that's how Rachav's house was. It was literally in the wall of the city. And there is one place in the excavations where, while everything looks like the whole entire city was destroyed, there is one house that they have found that is embedded into the wall of the city, only one stone's layer thick off the wall or into the wall, and it was clearly not destroyed. So the theory is this might be Rachav's house, because we know that Rachav's house was in the wall. They've only found one house that was not destroyed in all of their, whatever it is, 40 years of digging at Jericho. And so the theory is this might just might be Rachav's house. Number 3, and what I think is the most fascinating, is that when Kathleen Kenyon originally dug at Jericho, and subsequently other archaeologists have found the same thing, she found storehouses of grain that was in its containers yet burnt. Okay, so you're again trying to paint the historical theories that your wheels start to turn, and you would say, 1 second, this is clearly a city that was destroyed. It's clearly a walled city. So that means in order to destroy the city, you would assume that at some point there was a siege, and siege eventually led to destruction after the walls were breached, and that's what happened over here. Well, usually if there's a siege, all the food is consumed, right? Because that's what the sieging army wants. They want all the food to be consumed. They want the people to become desperate. They want them to surrender. Usually all the food would be consumed. So why is it that in Jericho, dig after dig, they always find these containers with burnt grains inside of them, and only burnt grains, never any representation of non-burnt grains, although I don't know if that would survive the 3,000 years, but they find this burnt ashes of burnt grains over and over and over again. Very strange, because it's not what you usually find in a city that a siege was laid unto. But if you look at the book of Joshua, it says as the Jews entered the city of Jericho, they could not take any booty. They had to burn everything to the ground. And therefore, it would make sense that you would find grain and sign of the grain being burnt. So that's the conquest of Jericho. And that's a little bit of archaeological, quote unquote, proof we have to the story as it's written in the book of Joshua. Okay, I'm going to pause quickly for questions. I see we have a bunch in the chat box, and we'll see if we have any others live. 19 books of prophets, right. So we count Shrei Usser as we count the 12 minor prophets as one book. Daniel is one of the writings, so that's in the section of Ksuvim. Oh, Julie answered that for us. Yes, you have to love a ger toshav like you love a ger tzedek. Definitely, when the Torah talks about not loving a stranger, loving a ger, and not being mean to a ger, that's talking about a ger toshav, a ger tzedek, meaning a full convert to Judaism, or just someone who chooses to live peacefully with the Jews and follow the Noahide code. Steve, I'm glad your Wi-Fi came back on. Okay, I think that's all the questions we have typed. Okay, any other questions before we continue? Anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask a question or put in the chat box? If not, we will continue. So I want to share one thing with you here that I'm gonna bring up the screen share here in a moment. As soon as I bring it on my screen, and then we'll put the link in the into the chat box for anyone who wants it afterwards. Okay. So let's just bring this up here. Okay, so this is the map of the conquest of Joshua. At least what we call the central campaign and the southern campaign. We don't know much about the northern campaign except the names of the places they conquered. But this is where the Jews were observing the mourning for Moshe. They crossed the Jordan River, which is right here. They camp at Gilgal, which is right here. Here's Jericho. And now we're going to see the next city we're going to go to is Ai, right? Ai is going to be the next city we're going to come to. And then in a moment, we're going to talk about the Gibeonites, Gibon, which is right over here. Okay, so this is a little bit map of the central and southern conquests. I'm going to give you all the links to this in the chat box in case you want to follow it along on your own or look at it afterwards. But in the meantime, let's continue talking about that conquest. So after Jericho, the Jewish people come to the city of Ai. Now, initially, the battle plan for Ai is a little bit different than it was at the time of Jericho. Jericho, the whole nation was involved. When it comes to Ai, Joshua says, let's just send 2,000 or 3,000 men against this one. And 2,000 or 3,000 was a fraction of a percent of the number of people that were in the nation at this time. There were about 3 million Jews, right? At this time. So, you do your math, 3,000 is a fraction of 1%. But, they all just witnessed the miracles at Jericho. So they say, okay, 3,000 men 2,000 to 3,000 men will take care of this. So Joshua sends 2,000 to 3,000 men. The people of Ai come out to attack those 2,000 to 3,000 men, and 36 Jews are killed. The Jews all of a sudden retreat. They go back to Joshua. They say, what happened? Something went wrong over here. This is not what it's supposed to be. This is not what's supposed to happen. Like what happened in Jericho didn't happen here. 36 died. What are we supposed to do about this? And they find out prophetically that there was somebody who took some spoils. And as we said, that as the Jews conquered the land of Israel, they were not allowed to take personal spoils at any point. And the person who took spoils is a man by the name of Achan, and he is identified, and he later confesses, and he's put to death. But it was interesting that small violation led to not only the death of 36 Jews, but it led to a failed first attempt to conquer Ai. Now, you might say, like, really? Because one guy screws up, the whole nation gets hurt? The 36 people have to lose their lives, and the whole nation gets hurt? So first of all, the simple Jewish philosophical answer is the Almighty judges the world kechutz asara, like a thread of a hair. And if those 36 people lost their lives, they must have deserved it. But beyond that, we have a concept of Kol Yisrael Re'evim Zelazeh. We talked about this before, that the whole Jewish people are a guarantor for one and another. So therefore, yes, if one Jew messed up and took spoils, it's the whole Jewish people's problem. And therefore, they cannot be successful in that battle. Achan is found out, he confesses, he's put to death. And finally, the Jewish people are ready for their second attempt on Ai. This time, Joshua sends 30,000 men because he realizes that it ain't going to all happen like Jericho, right? It's going to have to happen through some more practical military tactics. And so he sends 30,000 men, and those 30,000 men are successful. And by the way, the book of Joshua describes that they don't do it through walking around 6 times with the ark and blowing shofars and all that. No, they have a real military tactic this time. They say that we're gonna go up to the city, and then we're gonna retreat, or we're gonna send a few men up to the city, and then we're gonna retreat like we did before, and they'll think we're retreating again, and they will come out of the city, and then the 30,000 men will lay ambush to their army, and then we'll be successful and go in and burn the city down. Sounds like a great military strategy. Joshua is quite the military strategist. But really, there's a tinge of melancholy here, because what we see is that what Joshua learned from the situation before is that the Jewish people really were not ready for a completely miraculous conquering of the land of Israel, and therefore it was going to be necessary to use, regular good old military strategy to conquer the land of Israel. The third of the Canaanite nations we're told about is the Gibonim. Living in Gibon, again, just a little due west of where Ai is, as you can see there in your map. Now, who are the Gibonim? The Gibonim are southwest, actually. The Gibonim are interesting because they pull a ruse on the Jewish people. They take some of their emissaries and they have them dress up as if they're foreigners, as if they're not Canaanites, and they have them approach the Jewish people and say, we've heard about the amazing things. We heard about what happened in Egypt. We heard about what happened with Og and Moab and all those nations in the desert. We heard about Jericho. We heard about Ai. We want to sign a peace treaty with you. We want to sign an alliance with you. So Joshua says, fine, we'll sign an alliance, makes an alliance with these people. And then before they depart from the camp of the Jewish people in Gilgal, it is found out that they are, in fact, not emissaries from afar, that they're actually Givonim or Gibeonites from the land of Israel, from the land of Canaan. And the whole thing was a ruse. So Joshua says, why'd you do this? Because what happened was, they thought that initial warning that we talked about before of being given the chance of either signing a peace treaty, leaving, or number 3, having to go to war, they thought that was only going to be extended once. So when that was originally extended to them, when that offer, those 3 options, the 3 choices were originally extended to them, they said, no, thanks. We'll take our chances. And then when they found out about Jericho and Ai, they said, ay, we are in trouble over here. And they thought that they were not going to get another chance. So therefore, they had this subterfuge of trying to sign a peace treaty. And Joshua says, basically, you didn't have to do that, right? I was going to offer you again before the attack to sign a peace treaty with us. So Joshua says, just to show you how sincere I am, we're going to honor this treaty. Now, you're going to have to be the woodcutters. We're going to give you a little bit of a lowly job here in the nation, but we're going to honor the treaty. And as a proof, we see that there's going to be an attack on Gibon, on the Givonim. And Joshua is going to send the Jewish army to defend them. And that's the famous story with the sun standing still. That was all in defense of the Gibonim, because Joshua said, I'm going to prove to you, and really trying to send a sign to the other 28 nations that were left, or 29 nations that were left, that I mean it when I say we'll extend a peace treaty. Because here's a nation that even pulled some tricks on us, and still we're honoring our peace treaty with them. But be it as it may, these are the only 3 of the Canaanite nations and the story of the conquest of the Jewish people that the book of Joshua goes into in detail. The other ones are just listed by name. Now, the question is, why are we only given 3 details and the rest are just listed by name? Because what we see at this point is that, we have a process here. We had an option to go about it miraculous. That was Jericho. We failed. That was I part 1. And I part 2, we had to use military tactics. We see it put a certain amount of fear into the Canaanite nations. We see that they, but most of them do not respond like Gibon. Gibon is the only one who says that, okay, we'll take peace. But the rest of them say, no, we'll fight you. And just like what we saw in Ai is what repeats itself over and over again throughout the conquest of the land of Israel. And there's a total of 31 city-states that all take the option of war, and 31 city-states that lose in that war. Now, this war comes to an end 7 years after it starts. Now, at the time, Joshua had not successfully conquered the entire land of Israel. There were still pockets that we'll see were not completely conquered. They were somewhat subdued, but not conquered. Most notably was the Philistines, right? We're going to see that the Philistines are going to rear their ugly face time and time again. The Philistines, or the Pelishtim, as they are called in Hebrew, live in a place that we now refer to as the Gaza Strip. So yes, the Gaza Strip has always been a cesspool of problems for the Jewish people since time immemorial, but the Philistine people that occupied the Gaza Strip in those days have zero connection to the Palestinian people occupying the Gaza Strip today, other than they stole the name. Right? We're going to see that when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, that they changed the name of the land of Israel from Yehuda, which is what's called in the Second Temple, to Philistia, which means Pelishtim, the land of the Philistines, because they were leading a campaign to de-Judaize the land of Israel, and therefore they chose the name of the last known inhabitants before the Jews, who were the Philistines, and that's why Israel became known as Palestine from roughly the year 70 until the year 1948. And it's very fitting that the nomadic Arabs that lived in Israel for the roughly 100 years before the Jews came back and then multiplied because of job opportunities, as we'll talk about in many, many sessions down the road, they would call themselves the Palestinians, because just like the name, the whole purpose of the name Philistine, Palestine, Philistia, however you want to pronounce it, was to try to de-Judaize the land. That's, I'm sorry to say it. I'm sorry if I'm being politically incorrect, because you know me, I am PC, I'm AC, because when you're absolutely correct, you don't have to be politically correct. But they're trying to do the same exact thing that the Romans tried to do and de-Judaize the land, say there were never a Jewish people there, there was never a temple there. Okay, there's some archaeology that gets in the way. Okay, the whole reason Jerusalem is holy to Islam is because Solomon's temple was there, but they forget that fact and say that there was never a Jewish state on this land before the state of Israel in 1948, but flat out lie. And it's fitting that they take that name, Palestine, that the whole purpose was 2,000 years ago to try to de-Judaize the land of Israel. Okay, so the conquest takes 7 years, comes to an end, and then Joshua spends 7 years dividing up the land. Now, I've always had the question, Joshua's a prophet. Why did it take him so long, right? Why did it take 7 years to divide up the land? He knew prophetically where each tribe was supposed to go. He knew prophetically where the borders were, where the borders should be. Why did it take 7 years? I don't have a good answer to that. If anyone has a good answer, I'd be happy to take it. But the appropriation land takes another 7 years, bringing us up to the Jewish year 2503, secular year 1258 before the Common Era. And then after that, the land is somewhat calm. Joshua lives another 14 years or so peacefully, and eventually passes away in the year 2516 on the Jewish calendar, 1245 before the Common Era. Now, before he passes away, he gives in his last will and testament, similar to Moshe, because we said Joshua is the moon, Moshe was the sun. So he gives a similar, not quite as long as the book of Deuteronomy, but a similar last will and testament, a similar charge to the Jewish people, not to abandon the ways of the Torah, not to abandon the ways of Hashem, not to abandon Torah's Moshe. The Jewish people respond similar to how they did to Moshe, that we'd be crazy to abandon the laws of Moshe. But be it as it may, after Joshua passes away and we begin the book of Shoftim, the book of Judges, we see that unfortunately that is not going to be 100% the case. So Joshua passes away, and we are told next that there's a short time period known as the time of the Zikanim, the time of the elders. Who are the elders? The elders are essentially the leaders left over from the time of Moshe. Kalev, Pinchas, Eldad, Medad, and they lead for roughly 17 years. And when they pass away, the centrality of the Jewish people is basically disbanded. Now, there's still certain aspects of centrality. Number one is the Mishkan, right? There's still just one Mishkan. And the Mishkan was during the conquest and the apportioning of the land stayed in Gilgal, that first camp of the Jewish people, which is basically the capital during those times, and then eventually takes its home where it's going to be for 369 years in the city of Shiloh. And when it's in the city of Shiloh, it has the status of the temple. It's just like the temple, and that's the only place. You're right, there are no other mishkans around. At least there weren't supposed to be. We're going to see. There's some problems with that, but that's at least what's supposed to happen. Now, the Mishkan will do a little bit of traveling after Shiloh before it comes to Jerusalem when they build the temple, but we'll get to that in later sessions. Now, after Joshua and after the elders, it begins the time period of what we call the Shoftim, which is loosely translated as judges. And I say loosely translated because that's not a very good translation for what it was. Now, the confusion of the translation is because in general, Jewish vernacular, aka Hebrew, the word shofet or shoftim means judges. So therefore, it would make sense that we translate this as the book of Judges in the time period of Judges. But the word is being used a little bit euphemistically. It's being used metaphorically when it describes this time period. Because what we're going to see is during this time of the Shoftim, there's no central leadership other than the Mishkan with the Kohanim, with the priest. And yes, there is still a Sanhedrin, a high court. And yes, there are great prophets during this time, but there's no king. There's no Moshe or Joshua. There's no Saul, David, or Solomon, right? No king. But what we have is certain people who, when the Jewish people are in the need of defense and the need of salvation, there are going to be certain, sometimes great, sometimes not so great people who will arise to defend the Jewish people against the enemies of the Jews that challenge them. And in so doing, reinstitute the justice, reinstitute the ways of Hashem, reinstitute the peace. So while the only shofet, we are told, who actually judges is Devorah, the great prophetess, the other 14, we have no reason to believe they actually judged. Rather, through their escapades as the warriors of the Jewish people, through the head of the army, they reinstituted justice for the Jewish people. And that's what they all are. So therefore, it begs the question, how did a shofet become a shofet? And the answer is quite simply, most of them just through emerging as the person who is going to save the Jewish people. Some of them we'll see are actually appointed by prophets, right? The famous Shimshon, appointed by a prophet, right? We're going to see some of them are actually appointed by prophet, but for the most part, they're just the ones who ascend to be the head of the Jewish army, who bring salvation to the Jewish people. And like we'll see in next week's session, some of them are great, some of them not so great. And we will, God willing, begin next week going through the story of the judges. But I just want to give a backdrop, if I can indulge you all for just a few more minutes, as to the time period. Because we're going to talk about a time period where the prophet will say, by the way, as we go into the book of Judges is written by the prophet Samuel. Prophet Samuel wrote a number of books of Tanakh. He wrote the book of Judges. He wrote the majority of the book of Samuel and the book of Ruth. Those are all the writings of the prophet Samuel. So the prophet Samuel writes a number of times in the book of Shoftim, of Judges, or justice instillers, we'll call them, that every person, that there was no king in Israel at that time, and every person did what was right in their eyes. And it's a debate if that's a knock or if that's a good thing, right? If that was saying that they did terrible things because they're doing whatever they thought was right, or is actually good and they were doing good things. And we'll see as we discuss this time period what that means. But the just one interesting thing to close with is that the book of Shoftim ends with two despicable stories, truly despicable stories, one worse than the next. One is the story of Pilegesh Begibo, and the other is the story of Pesel Micha. Now, the story of Pesel Micha is a certain story of idolatry that happens, that the Jewish people become very involved in this idolatry that is perpetrated, and it leads to a great struggle amongst the Jews at that time. But the more really, I guess, heart-wrenching story is the story of Pilegesh Begibo, where there's a certain concubine who it's a story where there's no winners, there's only losers. But there was a concubine who was violated by a number of people from the tribe of Benjamin, and we see that her husband or master, whatever we call him, was very mean to her to begin with, left her outside to begin with, how she was running away from him. Terrible, terrible story. In the end, after she is violated by these members of the tribe of Benjamin, he takes her body, cuts it up into 12 pieces, and sends it to all 12 of the tribes, saying that, look what happened to my wife. And it's interesting what happens next. What happens next is a civil war breaks out, a civil war between the tribe of Benjamin and the other 11 tribes. Now, what was going on over here? So the way that it's explained is that the tribe of Benjamin also agreed that what was done by this handful of individuals was terrible, yet they felt that as the status quo was, that it happened, what happens in Benjamin stays in Benjamin. This happened in the tribe of Benjamin, so the courts of Benjamin would punish this, and there was no need for a national response to this atrocity. The other 11 tribes disagreed. They said, no, such an atrocity needs a response of all 11 tribes, needs to be tried in the high courts of all the tribes. We have to try them. And that's what led to the war. So you might say, like, really? That's what led to the war? Well, if you've ever studied any warfare, you know that many a war was started by a very small quarrel. I mean, as I always like to point out, and if you need an example of this, just read Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, which is a wonderful book about the outbreak of World War I. World War I was a family feud, big family fight, right? Interestingly enough, I just read in a book this past week that John F. Kennedy had recently read Guns of August right before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that book was part of his motivation not to let it escalate, to figure out a way to de-escalate as opposed to escalate, because he saw from that book that a stupid family fight led to a war with millions and millions of people being killed. Be it as it may, at this time in the Jewish people, we have a war breakout, we have a civil war breakout, and there's 3 major battles, and almost the entirety of the tribe of Benjamin is wiped out. Not only that, but there's a law made that the tribe of Benjamin cannot marry people from other tribes, and it's a very dark time for the tribe of Benjamin. Now, just parenthetically, that decree of the tribe of Benjamin being able to marry other tribes was eventually lifted on the 15th day of the month of Av. And that's another reason why Tu B'Av is considered a holiday. And that's really where it sort of gets its status, quote unquote, as the Jewish Valentine's Day, because we see it was a time of shidduchim, a time of matches were made, because that's when the tribe of Benjamin was once allowed to marry, and once again allowed to marry into the Jewish people. But I want to tell you just a macro idea, just a philosophical idea that comes out of these stories, or at least 2 ideas. I'm going to give you 2 ideas and then we'll conclude. Number one is that you can look at these stories and say, these are examples of how terrible of a time period it was during the time of the Shoftim, the time of Judges. My Rosh Hashiva, Shmuel Yaakov Weinberg, takes the opposite approach, as he often did. He often would turn things around on its head. And he said, no, it's the opposite. You see that there's this atrocity of a woman being violated, and it literally leads the nation to civil war. That shows the Jewish people really on a very high level, that one woman being violated could bring a whole country to civil war. One woman who was a Pelega, she wasn't even a full wife status to her husband, and that brought a whole country to civil war. So says my Rosh Hashiva, that shows the greatness of the Jewish people at this time, that they were still spiritually sensitive to terrible things, that when something terrible happened, that they respond in a tremendous way with literally a civil war. It's like God forbid today, if we open the paper and read about all kinds of atrocities, most people say that's terrible and move on. Well, the Jewish people at that time said that's terrible and we're going to take action. So that's what my Rosh Hashiva says. But there's another beautiful lesson, that according to most historical records, this story happens during the time period of the first Shofet, of Asniel ben Kenaz, who we'll talk about next week. Interestingly enough, the second Shofet, the second great leader that we're going to talk about, is somebody named Ehud ben Gera. What tribe does Ehud ben Gera come from? The tribe of Benjamin. So if this account is correct, that this terrible story happened during the first judge, Well, still we see the second judge is from the tribe of Benjamin, after the tribe of Benjamin brought the Jewish people to civil war and was written off, couldn't marry into any other nation. And the answer is the same idea we started with. You see from here that Judaism is a meritocracy, not an aristocracy or a dynastical religion. Because if Ehud ben Gera from the tribe of Benjamin was the best person to lead the Jewish people at that time, then he was going to do it despite what his tribe had done in the previous civil war. Now, just parenthetically, there are other opinions that the story happened actually at the end of the book of Shoftim, where we find it in the book. And then you can say the same exact thing, because what happens after the book of Shoftim? Well, we have the first king of Israel, who is none other than King Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. So wherever you put the story, be it at the beginning of the book, be it at the end of the book, you're going to have a subsequent leader from the tribe of Benjamin, which again brings out that idea that we started with, that the Jewish people are a meritocracy, a person from very lowly beginnings through just working and persevering and working on themselves can reach the highest of heights as a Jew. That's all I have to say for tonight. We'll stick around as long as you want for questions, but I thank you all for coming. I thank you all for listening. We'll continue next week. We'll talk about the judges. And with no further ado, we'll take a look at the questions you have. I see there's a few here in the chat box, and feel free to unmute yourself. Someone asked, are the Gibeonites alive today? I don't think so. I don't think we have any remnant of them alive today, or anyone who claims to be a remnant of them. Okay, any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or put in the chat box. Okay, so with no further ado, we'll call it an evening, and I will look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a great one.